Late in 1944, somewhere over the vast blue emptiness of the Pacific Ocean, a single F6F Hellcat cut through a scattered layer of clouds. The aircraft vibrated slightly as its engine pushed toward maximum power, the propeller biting hard into the thin air at altitude. Behind it, 9 Japanese interceptors climbed rapidly. They fanned outward across the sky, forming a wide pursuit pattern meant to trap their prey before it could escape. The American pilot checked his mirrors. 9 aircraft, all closing, all determined to destroy him. Under normal circumstances, the outcome should have been obvious. One fighter alone against 9 interceptors rarely survived long enough to tell the story. Yet something unusual was happening. The distance between hunter and hunted was not shrinking. It was growing. The Japanese pilots pushed their engines harder, tightening their formation as they attempted to close the gap. But the Hellcat continued pulling away. Later, the Japanese flight leader would summarize the engagement with a single line of frustrated analysis. "We could not keep up with the American aircraft." By the autumn of 1944, the Pacific War had transformed dramatically from the desperate defensive struggle it had been only 2 years earlier. American forces were advancing relentlessly across the ocean. Island after island fell to amphibious assaults supported by the most powerful naval aviation force ever assembled. The strategy was simple in theory and brutal in execution. Leapfrog across the Pacific. Capture key islands. Build airfields. Move closer to Japan with every step. Each victory shortened the distance between American bombers and the Japanese homeland. And each victory placed increasing pressure on the defenders. At the center of this campaign stood the Fast Carrier Task Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. It was not merely a fleet. It was a floating air force. Dozens of carriers moved across the Pacific like mobile airfields, launching hundreds of aircraft capable of striking targets hundreds of miles away. Fighter sweeps, reconnaissance patrols, deep strike missions, air operations that would have been impossible at the beginning of the war had become routine. By late 1944, the balance of power in the sky had shifted decisively. American fighters increasingly dominated the air war. The aircraft most responsible for that dominance was the Grumman F6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was not elegant. It lacked the tight maneuverability of the Japanese Zero. It lacked the sleek appearance of certain European fighters. But it possessed something more important. It was designed to win wars. The aircraft was strong, forgiving, and brutally effective. Its Pratt & Whitney R-2800 radial engine produced more than 2,000 horsepower, pushing the heavy fighter to speeds approaching 380 miles per hour. 6 .50 caliber machine guns gave it devastating firepower. Armor protected the pilot. Fuel tanks were self-sealing. And perhaps most importantly, the Hellcat could absorb damage and still bring its pilot home. American factories produced them in staggering numbers. By 1944, Hellcats flew from nearly every fleet carrier in the Pacific. They became the backbone of American carrier aviation. The men who flew them came from every corner of the United States. Farm towns, cities, factories, universities. Some had dreamed of aviation their entire lives. Others had barely seen an airplane before the war began. What they shared was the ability to adapt quickly to an environment where mistakes were rarely forgiven. Air combat was not only about courage. It was about judgment, situational awareness, and the ability to make correct decisions in seconds while traveling hundreds of miles per hour. One of those pilots served quietly in a fighter squadron aboard a fleet carrier operating deep in the Western Pacific. His service record described him in ordinary terms. Competent, dependable, professional. He was not considered reckless or brilliant. He did not dominate conversations in the ready room. He did not chase glory. Among louder personalities, he was easy to overlook. But war had a way of revealing qualities that peacetime evaluations often missed. And on one reconnaissance mission in late 1944, that quiet pilot would demonstrate something remarkable, not by destroying enemy aircraft, but by understanding something the enemy pilots did not. Before the war, his life had been simple. He grew up in the American heartland, the son of a family that had struggled through the Great Depression. Money was scarce. Expectations were modest. College had been a possibility for a short time before economic reality intervened. Like many young men of his generation, he discovered aviation through the civilian pilot training program. a government initiative designed to create a reserve of pilots in case war came. The program allowed young Americans to learn to fly at minimal cost. Thousands enrolled. Most had never touched an aircraft before. He proved to be a capable student. Not exceptional, but reliable. His instructors noticed that he stayed calm when other students panicked. He absorbed information methodically, and when he made mistakes, he rarely repeated them. Those qualities did not produce dramatic headlines, but they kept pilots alive. After Pearl Harbor, naval aviation expanded at a breathtaking pace. Training programs accelerated. Curriculums compressed. Young pilots moved rapidly through a pipeline that once required years. Primary training, basic training, advanced fighter instruction, carrier qualification. Each stage eliminated candidates who could not adapt to the pressure. He survived the process the same way he had survived flight school, by never failing. His evaluations described him consistently: dependable, capable, ready for fleet service. In wartime aviation, that was enough. By late 1944, he found himself assigned to a fleet carrier air group already hardened by combat. Some of the pilots in his squadron had fought in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where American fighters destroyed Japanese naval aviation in a catastrophic defeat remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Compared to those veterans, the new replacement pilot remained nearly invisible. His early missions passed quietly. Combat air patrols where nothing happened. Escort flights where bombers returned safely. Occasional strafing runs against ground targets that produced little measurable damage. He accumulated hours. He gained experience. But he remained what he had always been: a competent pilot among many competent pilots. Yet a few squadron mates noticed certain habits. He studied intelligence reports carefully. He asked detailed questions about Japanese aircraft performance. He spent time with intelligence officers learning about enemy tactics and operational patterns. It was not excitement. It was preparation, and it would soon save his life. The reconnaissance mission had seemed routine during the briefing. A single Hellcat would cross the enemy coastline, photograph several Japanese airfields, and return with updated intelligence for the carrier task force. These missions were dangerous but necessary. Commanders depended on accurate reconnaissance to plan future strikes. The pilot received the assignment through a series of small accidents. His section leader's aircraft had developed mechanical trouble during pre-flight inspection. His wingman had been grounded with a minor illness. The mission was time-sensitive, and he was available. In war, circumstances like these often determine who faces the impossible. He launched from the carrier deck late in the morning, his Hellcat heavy with extra fuel for the long flight. The Pacific stretched endlessly beneath him as he climbed to altitude. At cruising power, the engine produced a steady, familiar drone. The aircraft settled into the smooth rhythm that every pilot knew well, the quiet part of flight where attention shifted from control to observation. From high above the ocean, the war could almost feel distant. Almost. The coastline appeared ahead as a thin, dark line against the horizon. He crossed it without resistance. The first photography run proceeded exactly as planned. He circled the target airfield carefully, maintaining altitude while his camera equipment recorded images of runways, aircraft dispersal areas, and defensive positions. The photographs would help planners determine how many aircraft the Japanese still possessed in the region. The second run followed, then a third. Everything appeared normal, until the sky below him began filling with climbing aircraft. At first they were tiny specks emerging from the haze, then shapes, then fighters. He counted them as they rose toward his altitude. 3, 5, 7, more appearing behind them. 9 interceptors in total, climbing aggressively to cut him off before he could escape. 9 aircraft sent to destroy a single reconnaissance fighter. Standard doctrine was clear: disengage immediately. Do not fight. Run for home at maximum speed. The arithmetic of aerial combat made a fight against 9 opponents almost certainly fatal. He turned east toward the open ocean and pushed the throttle forward. The Hellcat responded immediately, its powerful radial engine surging as the aircraft accelerated. But the interceptors had chosen their position well. They were climbing from behind him and slightly to one side. Their formation was spreading outward to trap him between altitude and distance. The geometry of the intercept was dangerous, very dangerous. Yet instead of reacting instantly with instinctive maneuvers, he studied them. The Japanese fighters were approaching from his 7 o'clock position, climbing in a wide pattern designed to close his escape corridor. The leading aircraft were accelerating harder than the rest. The trailing aircraft followed more slowly. Already the formation showed subtle differences in spacing. 9 aircraft meant 9 different pilots, 9 engines, 9 fuel states, 9 decisions being made at once. From a distance, they looked unified. But he suspected the unity was an illusion. His Hellcat possessed advantages they could not easily neutralize. At his altitude, the R-2800 engine was performing near its most efficient power range. American aviation fuel burned cleaner and hotter than Japanese gasoline. The difference was small, but in a long pursuit, small differences mattered. Even more important was the way the Hellcat handled at high speed. The aircraft was heavier than the Japanese fighters. That weight worked against it in tight, turning battles. But in a dive, weight became an advantage. The Hellcat accelerated like a falling hammer. And unlike many lighter fighters, it remained controllable at extreme speeds. He knew exactly how far he could push the aircraft, because he had spent months learning every detail of how it behaved. He also knew something about the enemy pilots behind him. Japanese interceptor training emphasized aggressive pursuit, close combat, rapid engagement. Their doctrine encouraged pilots to chase relentlessly until they forced a fight. That aggressiveness had won them victories earlier in the war. But against a pilot who refused to fight at all, it could become a trap. He made his decision. He would not dive immediately. He would not turn sharply for home. Instead, he maintained altitude and altered his heading slightly, just enough to draw the interceptors deeper into pursuit. He would let them chase him, and he would force them to stretch their formation until their numerical advantage disappeared. The first shots came from extreme range. Bright tracers arced across the sky behind him, fading into nothing long before they reached the Hellcat. The Japanese pilots were eager. Too eager. They fired from distances where hitting him was nearly impossible. Each burst burned ammunition. Each burst burned energy. And each burst revealed impatience. He lowered the nose of the aircraft slightly. The airspeed indicator crept upward, 350 miles per hour, then higher. The Hellcat gathered speed steadily as gravity joined the engine's power. Behind him, the formation began to stretch. The fastest interceptors surged forward. The slower aircraft fell behind. The once tight intercept formation began to unravel. Exactly as he expected. He checked the mirrors again. The gaps between the pursuers were widening. Small separations that would soon become large ones. Ahead of him lay a distant bank of clouds. He turned gently toward it, not directly toward home. The maneuver forced his pursuers to adjust their angles again. Some cut across the turn. Others followed his path. The formation stretched further. 9 coordinated interceptors were becoming 9 separate chasers. Now the engagement became a contest of physics. He did not simply run in a straight line. That would have burned fuel too quickly. Instead, he managed the chase carefully. Small heading changes. Subtle altitude adjustments. Just enough movement to force the interceptors to constantly correct their approach. The Hellcat remained stable even at extreme speeds. Many Japanese fighters did not. Their controls became heavy. Their aircraft increasingly difficult to manage as velocity increased. And in a dive, the Hellcat accelerated faster than most of them could safely follow. He pushed the nose down farther. The ocean surface rushed upward as the fighter accelerated. The airspeed indicator passed 400 miles per hour. The control sticks stiffened under the airflow, but the aircraft remained stable. Behind him, the lead interceptors tried to follow. Some quickly fell behind. Others continued but gradually lost ground. The Hellcat was simply faster in the dive. At the bottom of the descent, he pulled smoothly back on the stick. The aircraft leveled and began climbing again. His pursuers faced a difficult choice. Climb after him and lose the speed advantage from the dive, or maintain speed and overshoot below him. Different pilots chose differently. The formation fragmented further. 9 interceptors were now scattered across thousands of feet of sky. Exactly what he wanted. He repeated the pattern. Dive. Build speed. Climb. Adjust heading. Every cycle stretched the pursuit farther. Every cycle burned fuel. For both sides. But his calculations suggested he could sustain the race longer than they could sustain the chase. And slowly, mile by mile, the distance between him and the enemy began to grow. The chase continued across the Pacific sky for what felt like an eternity. In reality, it lasted only minutes. But inside the cockpit, time stretched and compressed in ways only combat pilots understood. Every second seemed to expand as the mind processed dozens of details simultaneously. Speed, fuel, enemy position, distance to safety. Those were the only things that mattered now. The pilot kept repeating the same careful pattern. Dive, build speed, climb, adjust heading. Each maneuver forced the interceptors behind him to make decisions. And every decision they made increased the distance between them. At first, the Japanese pilots pressed the chase aggressively. They pushed their engines harder. They tried steeper dives. They fired occasional bursts of gunfire from distances that were more hopeful than realistic. Bright tracers streaked toward the Hellcat again. They still fell short. The American fighter remained just out of reach. But the formation behind him was changing. The fastest aircraft remained closest. Others had already begun falling back. The 9 interceptors that had once climbed together were now scattered across miles of sky. Pairs and individual aircraft chased him at different altitudes, each pilot trying to regain the advantage that had slipped away. Their numerical superiority had slowly dissolved. The Hellcat pilot noticed something else. Some of the pursuers had stopped firing entirely. That meant they were thinking about something more important than victory: fuel. Interceptor pilots launched quickly when radar spotted an enemy aircraft. But they rarely carried the long-range fuel loads needed for extended pursuits over open ocean. The longer the chase lasted, the more dangerous the situation became for them. Not for him. He entered another shallow dive. The airspeed climbed again. For 100 miles per hour. The engine roared steadily. The aircraft vibrated slightly under the increasing airflow, but it remained stable. Behind him, the lead pair of interceptors tried to follow one last time. They pushed their aircraft hard, diving steeply in an attempt to close the distance. For a moment, the Hellcat pilots saw them gaining. Their silhouettes grew larger. Then the distance stabilized. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began increasing again. They had reached the limits of their aircraft. The Hellcat continued pulling away. One of the interceptors broke off first. Its pilot rolled away from the chase and turned back toward land. The decision was simple: continue pursuing and risk running out of fuel over the ocean, or return home while there was still time. Another fighter followed moments later. Then another. The formation behind the Hellcat was shrinking. 9 interceptors had begun the chase. Now only a handful remained. The American pilot checked his fuel gauge. The needle had dropped dangerously low. The high power settings needed to maintain escape speed had consumed fuel at alarming rates. His calculations suggested he had perhaps 15 minutes before he would be forced to reduce power. But 15 minutes at high speed covered a long distance, and he had already gained far more separation than the interceptors could easily recover. Ahead of him, far beyond the endless blue water, lay the carrier task force. Somewhere over that horizon, American fighters were patrolling the skies. The Japanese pilots knew it too. Continuing the pursuit meant flying deeper into airspace where American aircraft might appear at any moment. For them, the chase had become too dangerous. Another interceptor turned away, then 2 more. Finally, the last pair abandoned the pursuit. 9 aircraft had attempted to intercept a single reconnaissance fighter. Not one of them had been able to catch him. The pilot watched them disappear in his mirrors. Only then did the tension in his body begin to fade. His hands relaxed slightly on the controls. But the mission was not finished yet. He was still alone, still far from the fleet, and still low on fuel. He reduced the throttle carefully. The Hellcat slowed to a more economical cruising speed. The engine noise softened. Fuel consumption dropped immediately. Now the fight for survival became a routine flight. Compass heading, fuel monitoring, radio checks. The long, quiet process of returning home across an empty ocean. Minutes later, the first ships appeared on the horizon. Small gray shapes scattered across the water. The carrier task force. To a tired pilot, there was no more reassuring sight in the world. He approached the carrier and entered the landing pattern. The flight deck rolled gently with the motion of the sea. Deck crews waited beside the arresting wires. He lowered the landing gear and lined up with the deck. The Hellcat descended. The hook caught a wire with a violent jolt. The aircraft slammed to a stop. The engine fell silent. On the carrier deck, the moment passed almost unnoticed. One more Hellcat had returned from a mission. One more pilot climbed out of his cockpit. The deck crews pushed the aircraft aside so the next landing could begin. Just another aircraft. Just another day in the Pacific War. During the debriefing, intelligence officers focused mostly on the reconnaissance photographs he had taken. The images of Japanese airfields were valuable. They confirmed aircraft positions, runway conditions, and defensive preparations. The chase itself received only brief attention. A reconnaissance pilot had been intercepted. He escaped. The report was filed. Only later did analysts studying captured Japanese communications discover the full story. The interceptors had reported their encounter to headquarters. Their description was short and blunt. They had attempted to intercept a single American fighter. Despite their numerical advantage, they could not close the distance. The American aircraft maintained speeds they could not match. The final assessment became the most famous line of the encounter. "We could not keep up with the American plane." The pilot himself never became widely known. He did not become an ace. He received no dramatic decorations for aerial combat. His record remained exactly what it had always been: reliable, professional, competent. Yet the lesson of that chase quietly spread through naval aviation. Pilots studying the report realized something important. He had not escaped simply because the Hellcat was fast. He escaped because he understood how to use it. He fragmented the enemy formation. He forced individual pilots to make independent decisions. He used altitude, speed, and patience to turn a coordinated interception into a scattered chase. He had not fought 9 fighters. He had turned them into 9 separate problems. The Hellcat's reputation for survivability grew with each story like this. Pilots who once wished for lighter, more maneuverable aircraft began to appreciate the balance of the F6F's design. It was strong, fast in a dive, stable at high speed, and capable of bringing its pilot home from situations that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. Training programs incorporated lessons from encounters like this one. New pilots learned that survival in combat did not always mean destroying the enemy. Sometimes survival meant refusing the fight entirely. Sometimes the smartest move a fighter pilot could make was simply not to fight at all. The quiet pilot continued flying missions until the war ended. He never became famous, but he became something equally important: a professional who survived. And in a war decided by millions of small advantages accumulated across thousands of miles of ocean, pilots like him mattered more than statistics ever suggested. Because sometimes the difference between victory and defeat is not courage, not aggression, but understanding the mathematics of the sky, and knowing when the only way to win a fight is to refuse it completely.